Eric is going to have to be our Hegel resource since he's the only person here that has had familiarity with Hegel prior to this. So spirit. So what did we go through first? Self or consciousness, and then self-consciousness, and then reason, and now we're up to spirit. So it would be nice to have some idea of what he means by spirit. I mean, it's clearly not that, you know what there's three manifestations of spirit that Hegel mentions that I can't remember. There's like objective. I don't. You guys remember what those are, Eric or Joey?
In this section, I'm thinking.
No. In general, in general, there's three.
Art, philosophy, and religion.
It's what?
Art, philosophy, and religion.
That's it. Yeah, art, philosophy, and religion. And so spirit is clearly not merely. I mean, it may be an addition. It's not merely a, some ethereal cosmic principle, but
is that related to like objective, subjective, absolute? Is that him? Does he talk about that?
I don't know. I mean, he does talk about absolute, but I
or just like objective spirit, subjective spirit. I feel like that's like elementary introduction to Hegel. That I remember I think we talked about that in your class, Nevitt, but I don't remember how that really plugs into his system at all, and if those are related.
Eric seems to think maybe yes.
I gotta, from what we can gather from Hegel, right? It's all systematically related in one form or another. Anytime you can pose things as subject and object, if you can have subjective spirit and objective spirit, then you can pretty well guess that Hegel is going to find a way to intimately relate them. One thing I noticed, is how oftentimes he talks about the unity of two disparate things that he then goes off and talks about the differences, their different manifestations, which leads you to question what underlying unity he was talking about to begin with, or how strict or how firm, or, how united, it was that he either is beginning with or ending with when he speaks of these unities, right? But yeah, I want to say subjective and objective spirit. I know that he mentions these things. I don't think he has a really laid out a distinction between the two of them, but I fully expect him to interrelate them, right? In one form, dialectically oppose them, and then speculatively unify them.
Yeah, I mean, my guess is that his whole project seems to be to show the ultimate unity of everything, some sort of unity and diversity. So even like in this section toward the end, like this was like section 461, almost at the very end, the whole is a peaceful equilibrium of all the parts. And then he says, to be sure, this equilibrium can only be a living equilibrium because of an inequality that arises within it. However, justice, but then, then that's sort of that inequality is then, I don't know if resolved is the right word, but is, I don't know what, sublated or resolved or something by justice. So yeah, my sense is he's ultimately going to say everything is unified, but it's a unity in this dialectical diversity.
Sorry, real quickly. I was going to say, I think where we started, we're like, what does exactly he mean by Geist or spirit, right? Well, I mean, again, I think where we're starting here, and this is a useful starting point, but it should definitely undergo modification and alteration as you follow the train of thought with Hegel. But I'm sure you've heard it mentioned before, that oftentimes the Geist in the phenomenology of Geist is very similar to the Geist when we talk about Zeitgeist, right? So especially in this section, he's talking about, like the ethical community and the polity and the things like that. I really feel like, that Geist, as in the spirit or the consciousness of a collective, it largely applies, right? And then just, where Nevitt was just discussing here about an equilibrium that is maintained through subordinate, inequalities, right? The metaphor, I don't know if this is helpful for anybody. I don't know if this is useful or accurate, but the metaphor that came to my mind was something like a calm sea with all sorts of like currents and flows that happen underneath it, right? So there might be various instances of inequality, but the system itself is supposed to resolve those inequalities and create a harmony or a, an overarching equilibrium, right?
Yeah, the thing that I keep wondering about, there seems to be a tendency these days to say that there seems to be a tendency to move away from some sort of, I don't know, it's hard, I can't even use the word spiritual, but some sort of interpretation. In other words, there tends to be a drive toward kind of like materialistic interpretations of Hegel these days that sort of reduce anything else out of it. But the first two or three sections of the first couple of sections, I guess, to me sounded like, how was that I put it on Discord? It was like, Spinoza's God plus dialectic. Because he opens up saying in the very first sentence, reason is spirit, as the certainty of being all reality has been elevated to truth, and reason is to itself consciousness of itself as its world and of the world itself. And then later on, he talks about ethical substance, but then on page 254, these are just a few sentences here and there. Spirit is the substance and the universe self-equal lasting essence. That sounds like Spinoza's God to me. And then this spirit is thereby the self, this is the beginning of 439. Spirit is thereby the self-supporting absolute real essence. All the previous shapes of consciousness are abstractions from it. Spirit is thus consciousness, full stop. And so all of those pronouncements sound like it's not, those don't sound very materialistic to me. It's like maybe, so anyway, it sounds to me, again, like it sounds like Spinoza plus dialectic, something like that.
Right. It brings up an issue. I guess that's one of the issues that's kind of been bouncing back and forth between myself and Hunter, right? Is I feel that these materialist reinterpretations of Hegel are just that, right? They're going back and finding, that he had a lot of interesting things to say, his method, his goals, some of the passing comments along the way, but that the overarching, again, the overarching system, his idealism is unacceptable. His system doesn't quite hold together, right? But along the way, in making the effort, he had a lot of really profound insights. And I feel like a lot of 20th century philosophers are wanting to recover those insights, but outside of the idealism. So they go back into Hegel and they focus on certain notions within Hegel and that are valuable. And a lot of times they're pretty explicit, like Hegel didn't really mean this, right? Or this is lifted out of Hegel's system. So I'm not really subscribing to Hegel's system. I'm not a total Hegelian here, but I think there's something valuable, but then something happened. I don't know. It seems to me that another generation of people have taken it up and just assumed that it was all in Hegel all along, that actually, if you read Hegel, the way I read Hegel, he was always a materialist. And I think the generation of people who were trying to recover this value from him would have said, no, he was never a materialist. But he had some profound insights. His system, although it fails and doesn't hold together, there's some interesting things. There's some valuable moves that he makes that we could probably, reiterate with a difference, and so here we go. And then maybe, I don't know, it doesn't make, I'm just trying to make sense of it. Like, why do we now have people who are seeming to insist that Hegel wasn't an idealist, or, like that this reading was actually an authentic reading of Hegel all along instead of a creative rereading of Hegel, right?
I'm recalling, because I listen to a lot of the Y Theory podcast, and they're all about Hegel, but they're kind of on that Zizek interpretation. But I've heard them say things, and they'll say it about Lacan, they say it about Hegel, where they're just like, oh, Hegel was Hegelian, was most Hegelian, at this point. And then they talk about how thinkers will fall out of almost where they were supposed to go or when they were most themselves.
Which is ironic coming from Zizek, since I'm not really sure where he's going or constructing himself after making it through most of Less Than Nothing. All I've understood from him is that it's ideology, and that's about it. But that's, I mean, then again, I haven't read a lot of them.
One of the most materialistic philosophers, Karl Marx, I mean, spent some time with Hegel. I don't mean literally they were having a beer together. I mean, just reading what Hegel wrote. And Marx didn't see materialism in Hegel. That's why he even though he thought there was something to the dialectic, thought that there was that the emphasis of Hegel was misplaced. Right. And he, to me, Marx, and I'm not saying Marx is great. I'm just saying Marx, who was sincerely trying to use some Hegelian processes or principles, didn't see materialism in his philosophy. That's why he developed his, along with borrowing, in addition to borrowing from Hegel, he borrowed from British political economy and French socialism. But Eric, I think, if we're going to be true to what Hegel is trying to do, we can't turn him into a materialist. We have to deal with him. If it's ideational, it's spirit, that's where we have to try to make sense of him.
Just a side rant. The way Eric described Hegelian scholarship is exactly the way I see Nietzsche scholarship as well. Rather than there are many who, rather than trying to figure out what Nietzsche actually was saying, there's been some who have, I can cite one in particular, but there have been some who have explicitly said, we are interpreting Nietzsche in such a way that he is maximally compatible with contemporary scientific and philosophical thought, which is no longer Nietzsche. I mean, like you said, maybe it's something exactly like Eric said, it's taking insights from Nietzsche and saying, we still, those are useful and that can help us understand these other things. But to say that it is Nietzsche, and I think that's, because those sort of two modes that you described, like, well, there's stuff in Hegel that we think is really helpful and we're going to borrow that I think is pretty honest. But to say that this stuff is Hegel, or like Joey was saying, well, here's where Hegel's really being Hegel, to me, I don't know, it just seems disingenuous, and I don't know. But one of the things, I'm sorry, go ahead, Eric. You were going to.
I was just going to throw this out there too. I think maybe one of the things that Marx appreciated in Hegel, and I can say probably Adorno appreciated in Hegel and a lot of other in between, is that of the German idealist, his dialectical approach is, and the way he runs things is that although he's an idealist and everything the system always like gets wrapped up in the end with this big idealist bow, he packs a lot of material considerations into it, and that kind of gives extra punch to it. So in terms of like thinking about what a lot of Kant was thinking about and the subsequent German idealists were thinking about, if we want to talk about freedom, if we want to talk about, agency and, just knowing things, a lot of these philosophical topics, and then you have this background to draw from. Hegel kind of lends himself, because although he is an idealist, he wants to incorporate the material in his overall package, right, in the system. And so what I want to say is that what I think Adorno, and specifically Adorno, finds in Hegel is that Adorno is a materialist, but he likes how Adorno's approach is to not be uber materialist all the time. He recovers something of idealism like that the spiritual element. He still uses spirit as a very important term in his philosophy, even though he's a materialist. So I think that's, somebody who's a bit more familiar with Adorno, I can say, I think one of the things that recommends Hegel to Adorno, as opposed to Fichte, Schelling, Kant, or any of the others, is this dialectical element, and that he does seemingly straddle both materialism and idealism, although he does come down on one side or finish on one side. I think that's what, Adorno kind of likes that and wants to finish on the other side. Ultimately he's a materialist, but he really doesn't want to let go of talk about spirit and ideology and all of these other things. It's also hugely important. In terms of being a reciprocal relation, that is kept. It's just the emphasis of the accent is placed on the other syllable, right?
Nietzsche is no idealist at all, and he uses the word spirit a lot, and he uses it, more along the lines that Hegel does when Hegel's talking about art, philosophy, and religion. It's like these something like the creative output of the human, of humanity. That spirit is like that. So that word is problematic in philosophy in general. And then the other thing, and this is something that I'm like most things, I'm kind of giving up on actually understanding Hegel at the end of this book. But one of the things I wish I would understand is what kind of idealist he is, because he's not, and this is, I think, something Eric was trying to point to. He's not like Berkeley, for example. So like Berkeley says, everything is ideas. There is no material reality of any kind at all. To be is to be an idea. And we are non-material souls, and God is injecting this reality into our souls, like the architect in the Matrix. And so we're like in the Matrix, except there's no body in the pod. There's just these spirits. Well, Hegel's not that. And then Fichte is like you said, is really an idealist, almost like a subjective idealist, where everything is ideas in the mind. That's where Adorno goes.
All right, I was just answering Joey's question in the chat.
Oh, okay. So Hegel's clearly not a Berkeleyan idealist. He's not a Kantian transcendental idealist. He's not Fichte is kind of similar to Berkeley, except that it isn't God that is injecting. My reading of Fichte is that we sort of these non-material souls kind of bounce into each other and sort of fabricate a shared reality of some kind. But it's not, he's not that. He's not a Fichtean idealist. And like in this section, and maybe he'll say more about this later in this book, I don't know. But one thing I've never understood is, what does Hegel mean by the word nature? And we got a little flavor of it in this section, where he's talking about nature is without, I'm probably going to say something wrong, but nature is without consciousness, because he said like a dead person is like this pure being, having but stripped of consciousness, and it cannot, this dead person can no longer return into itself, specifically because it lacks consciousness. And so, what is that? I mean, is that materiality, or is it like, I remember reading something somewhere that said like nature is like calcified spirit or something. I don't know what that means. But again, what I don't understand, what kind of idealist whatever kind of idealist is, it is not a simple idealism. It's a really complicated, like Eric said, some sort of dialectical thing. But I don't know if it's like, there's consciousness and not consciousness, and the two are in some sort of dialectical relation, and one tends toward the pole of consciousness and one tends toward the pole of materiality. I don't know, is it that, or is it that there is this like dead material world and consciousness invades it in some way? I just don't know. I don't understand, what the answer is for Hegel.
The thing that really struck me about this reading, at least for me, that I found somewhat helpful, and again, because it's like you said, it's a very difficult concept to grasp, even with outside sources. This is very, at least challenging for me. the section on 266 on 444, it's almost it's like he's saying that the thinker and the thinking are one and the same, like process and being are the same for him, which I'm wondering if that's where he combines this sense of like materialism or realism and idealism, because it's almost like he's saying by the action of participating, the process and being, the consciousness are essentially the same. So it's almost like there's this unification in the structure of consciousness or existence, mental or elsewise, that leads to the dialectic in ethics. Like, you know, and that's where I got confused. He almost seems to be talking like, okay, I grasped that part and I got that part. Well, I was like, okay, that makes sense to me. But then he says, when you start investigating or trying to find what an ethical system is, and you lose that aspect of being, the ethical system falls apart and it's no longer there. And that's where I was like, then how do you establish what? You know, like, so is this like a quantum state thing where as soon as we investigate it, it changes its state, but it's like the, you know, and we're shifting this into epistemology and ethics? Because that's a that's a big one.
Well, you know, this may be reading too much Deleuze into Hegel, but which I don't understand Deleuze either, but just Deleuze words kind of that I hear these guys talking. But there does seem to be this this thing in Hegel where, you know, like Hunter's used the word things always fail, but some things fail better. And I've tried to push him on what does better mean when he says fail better. Hunter hasn't been able to come up with an answer yet. But this notion of, I think that's the sense of the dialectic, in that things are never exactly what they are because they're always on the way to becoming their, I guess, their opposite or something like that. So it's not, you can't, I don't think, you know, and again, Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, or Joey, but I don't think everything and anything is fully completely what it is, maybe unless it's dead matter. I don't know, because being shot through with dialectic, everything is always on the move. And, you know, that was one of the complaints that Plato had about the world of phenomena, you know, as opposed to the world of forms. You know, Plato said, nothing in this world of sensory experience can ever be, because in order for something to be, in the fullest sense of the word to be, it cannot change, because be means to be. And this domain of phenomena, nothing ever is. Everything is always on its way to being what it is not. And, you know, so a tree is on its way to becoming a table, is on its way to becoming dust, is on its way to be incorporated into something else. Everything's always shifting and changing. And so nothing ever fully exists because it's the domain of becoming. And then so Plato reasons that there must be some domain of pure being where things are always only what they are. And those are the forms. And that's why the domain of the forms is the domain of absolute unchanging reality, is because it's only in the domain of forms where things fully are, because they never change. And I guess one way of reading Hegel is there is no domain of forms. There is only the domain of becoming, but it does have structure, and that structure is dialectic. And because I think, you know, Plato would say this shifting, changing domain of becoming, it obviously has some structure that it's trying to maintain. Well, where is that structure? Well, it's not in the becoming. That structure has got to be in the forms. And so it's like the forms are trying to impose an order on this shifting, changing shit all the time. And the forms cannot keep this domain of phenomena stable, because the underlying stuff is this chaos of, you know, the receptacle from the Timaeus, where things are just falling apart and shifting. And the structure is coming from the forms. And, you know, one way I think of what Hegel is saying is you don't need to have this domain of pure being in order to maintain structure. You can see that there is structure implicit in the becoming itself. And that structure has this, but it's not a fixed structure. It's a dynamic structure that's dialectic. And so I think, one reason you see this sort of language where, like in that section that you pointed to on 444 on page 256, he says that toward the end, the contradiction of what ethical life is in and for itself, and it meets its own downfall. You keep seeing that kind of phrase over and over. It meets its own downfall. It meets its own downfall. And I think that's the dialectic, and Hegel saying, Plato was right. This is a domain of becoming, but it isn't a chaotic becoming. It is a structured becoming. But like Plato's right. He's right. The table's going to become something else, and then that's going to become something else, and that's going to become something else.
No, I liked how you said that, Nevitt. The idea of obviously things exist. Well, I'll say, be a little barefoot empiricist. Obviously things exist, but that they're not exactly the same. And who was the philosopher we read last year? The French, I thought he was 20th century, who was trying to incorporate all the biology.
Merleau-Ponty?
Oh, Ponty, yeah.
Or Bergson.
No, it was Ponty, if I remember correctly. I'm still me, all right? I'm still Ed Mahalkanen. And I've been me, whatever that means, since I was born. But obviously, the me that's here now is different from the me when I was 33 or 21. You know what I'm trying to say? So how there's this continued reality, but obviously I'm not the same person. And it isn't just biological processes from infancy to adulthood, but my interaction with the environments that I've been a part of. And so even if one can say, yes, this person named Ed exists and has existed, I'm not exactly the same person. And so I think I'm guessing that what Hegel is trying to get a handle on is, what is the processes by which the me who was 63 is different from the me who was 1 year old, right? I mean, we all get a sense, obviously, that, yeah, we're different, but is there a key to this? Is there a process? Is there some way that we can understand it, not only for any one individual person, but for all persons?
Yeah, I think, like if you look at someone like Descartes, who says that we each have this soul that is fixed. And so, if you say, why am I the same Nevitt over the course of my life? It's because I have a fixed soul. All the stuff inside of it changes, but that soul is the same from the day of my birth to the day of my death. Whereas, a lot of people, probably before Hume, but certainly Hume after, thinks that's not right. And so, I don't know if it's Chase, we read Whitehead a while back, who is a process philosopher, and you can kind of think of Hegel as a process philosopher in saying that there is only process. There are no fixed things, there are just processes, and that processes have a relative stability for some length of time. And so then I think, like you were saying, I'm guessing, I don't know, but I'm guessing Hegel would say, I am not the same Nevitt that I was yesterday or 20 years ago, but there's been a process that's been continuing that has a relative consistency over time, but it is not like an absolute consistency. It's just this process that has a certain inertia to it that changes over time. And I'm guessing that Hegel would say that's, since everything's dialectical, I'm guessing he would say that personal being is a dialectical process as well. Although I haven't seen him say anything in here about personal identity enough to say for sure, but that would be my guess.
Yeah, I would say that that's kind of been the way that I read him, but it does feel like, yeah, I pull a lot of like just process philosophy into everything I read now. Something I wanted to point out was, I don't know if he ever makes direct reference in here, but I'm still, reading through this Logic of Desire commentary. And he talks about this like episode of spirit being like exemplified in Antigone, or Antigone, the literature or the play that y'all are reading, which I've actually been sifting through on my own. I wasn't able to make the meeting, but like, did y'all know that was coming up in here when y'all chose it?
Yeah, Chase explicitly.
Yeah,
So
you missed out. Eric was defending Creon the whole time. It was horrible.
That's great.
Joseph
I'm almost finished with it.
No, I was doing that. He wasn't. I'm sorry.
But yeah, I thought that was interesting because he will directly compare it to that. And I don't know, were y'all like getting the references when he was talking about death and the act that like redeems, saves the person from? Yeah, that was just so clear. But like, I don't know, like in how you were saying, Nevitt, that you're like at the point where like you're giving up on understanding Hegel. I was kind of noting that to myself the other day, that like I'm reading this along with it, and I feel like he's giving me these like concrete surface little like narrative to follow along with. And I feel like I definitely see that, like in every section I read, I see that maybe more like on the surface, like an example of what Hegel's talking about. But I feel like I'm missing out on actually like understanding the wording that Hegel's trying to, like, I feel like there's a reason Hegel's not explicitly talking about that. There's a reason like he's using the language he's using, and I feel like I'm missing out on this like immersion into the logic. And I'm realizing that there's so many words that I'm just like, when he says them, I have like, kind of like no clue. Like when he talks about simplicity, I have really no clue what that means. And just like as simple as like essence and substance, and like even just, I mean, all these words that I'm like, what? Like, I just kind of glaze over those, and I get to the parts that like I'm like, okay. And that's like, I always feel like I like get something from it, but I cannot absolutely, like, I just don't know what he's talking about when he uses some phrases and wordings that I feel like are the words he uses most. And
I'm absolutely with you.
Yeah.
Substance, essence, concept.
And it's stuff where it's just like, well, I went to school for philosophy, like those are the words I should know, right? Like I can't bring those words up in the seminar, or I can't start talking to people about Hegel, like I don't know the philosophical terms.
Yeah, and the problem is I will read along and I assume I know what this word means, because like you said, I've studied philosophy, and then I'll read, and then like 2 pages, I'll like, oh my God, whatever I was thinking he means by essence, that's not what he means. Or universal, or individual, or all those big technical philosophical words. I mean, like Hunter said once, they're not unrelated to the tradition, but they're also not exactly what the tradition has defined them as. And that's one of the reasons I when I'm reading and I think I understood, I'm always questioning. It's like, well, I think I understand this, but because I don't really understand how he's using this vocabulary, and I feel like I've had the rug pulled out from under me so many times, where I thought he knew what thought he knew what he meant by this technical term, and then like 5 pages later, I'm like, oh nope, I don't know.
Well, you made it 5 pages, like 2 sentences later for me. Jeez.
And I find myself in that boat with a lot of texts, I guess, especially like the texts we read. Like I feel like, someone like Deleuze, when I first read Deleuze, I feel like there was a part of me that did make more of an attempt to adopt the language, and I didn't read any secondary sources, and so I feel like I got more of that immersion effect. But everything I read nowadays, like the technical language is kind of lost on me, and I feel like it's easy for me to just like pull out my sense of it and then leave the technical language behind. But it does make me feel like, well, what right do I have to like really talk about the philosopher if I haven't really picked up their technical language? And I listen to podcasts, particularly like the Y Theory, where they get very technical, and they're like Lacan, Hegel scholars just about. So, and like they talk, and I'm just like, it's just same boat. I'm like, I have no clue when they use these terms. I'm just like, well, what does that term mean? But I was very interested just when he was talking about man and woman, and what I read in Calcavage, like about the war thing too, kind of the inequality that allows like justice to play its role. and like how war just introduces the like disequilibrium that allows like the polis to pull the families, to pull the divine law like back into itself. It was so just like, wow. Like Hegel,
And
I mean, you know, I feel like for the most part in the beginning, it seems very easily just like almost like like maybe more like phenomenology as I know it, where it's just like, but this was almost just like, you know, like mythical in this sense, like talking about man and woman and like unconscious and like, I don't know, it was very like it didn't feel as much like I was reading like technical scholarly philosophy as I was just like really interesting stuff. And I recall too, like at the beginning, maybe Chase said, like at the beginning of our seminar, Chase said something about, yeah, they say the beginning sections of the phenomenology are like what matter most. And like, so I have kind of like that, like left a little like shadow in my mind of like, does Hegel get really out there when he starts talking about spirit, religion, knowing? I don't know if that's really where he's going, but I just thought it was interesting, all this man woman stuff. And then like another part at the beginning that I thought was interesting, and Kalkovage points this out, and I feel like I saw a glimpse of it in section like 439 on page 255, where he gets into saying, like at the end of that section, he says, then spirit is in its truth. And the following section too, section 440, I feel like there he's talking about how we shift out of just shapes of consciousness, but we're talking about shapes of the world. I thought that was interesting. And Kalkovage points out how like this is where like history comes to play like an explicit role for Hegel. And then the other point, so at the end of 339 or 439, where it's like spirit is in its truth, Kalkovage points out how in every other shape, consciousness has started out in certainty and moved to truth, which like undermines its certainty. But he says like in these shapes, it plays the opposite, goes the opposite. So we start out in truth in this like ethical substance, and it's going to move towards certainty. And I don't know if that entails like technically like a loss of truth, but I'm thinking about how like, yeah, we do lose this paradise of the Greek polis.
Isn't that where he goes into the unhappy consciousness when reason reaches certainty and it obtains what it needs, it's essentially deconstructed and it makes it unhappy, so it goes through that process again. I thought he said something
recall.
like that. I can't remember.
Yeah, maybe.
What you said resonated with that, like the process of certainty to truth, and then once it has it, moving to uncertainty.
Yeah, I guess
like
I'm thinking like when I hear that, that's the process of like the earlier shapes, right? Like so consciousness moves from certainty to truth. And I guess, yeah, so it may like, but it always like develops a new certainty, right? Each truth kind of comes with a new certainty that it then has to like undermine again.
One of my problems there is, again, truth is one of those words I don't really know what he means. I mean, I really don't. You know, there's, you know, today truth in, I don't know, analytic philosophy at least, and I guess and more than that, you know, truth is a property of propositions, right? So, you know, after Frege and those guys, it's like, you know, I am here, that is a proposition, and truth is a property of propositions. But then, you know, in an older tradition, like in Descartes, the way he uses truth is the adequation, the adequatio, you know, it's the relationship between an idea in the mind and the thing in the world. So if I say, you know, my idea of this camera is true, then what that means is that that thing actually exists independently of the mind. And, you know, you see people, even some philosophers using it in a similar way, but I'm not really sure, you know, I mean, the strange thing is I think of the word truth as being something in a claim of objectivity or something like that. Like, well, this is true means, you know, it's sort of incontrovertibly true. But because Hegel is going through these dialectical shifts and he talks about truth at different places in this dialectic, I don't actually know what he means by truth.
Yeah, and I'm recalling too what he mentioned, what we kind of talked about last seminar, where Hegel does talk about like the true and the false and how they get reconceptualized when they like find their higher whole. And the idea isn't that we stop using true and false because we like have like a new, more complete concept, but that true and false get like, redeployed in their new sense. And I feel like, that is what I keep telling myself. I'm just like, yeah, no clue what he's using like essence to talk about. But I think like maybe because he just keeps shifting shapes. And so essence is always applying to something new. And I mean, like, I don't know if that's correct, but it's like comforting for me to be like, I don't really need to know what essence means yet. It's just one side of the dialectic. It's just one of the moments that he's always using it to refer to like this moment or that moment. And in the next shape is going to mean something different. And I mean, like that too feels like it makes sense of how I've still been able to take something away, even though I don't know what he's talking about with these things. At least in that paragraph too on 439, when he is talking about truth, I feel like he's also saying like it's actual. And so, yeah, I feel like I'm reading it there, like spirit is actual, but it doesn't have its certainty. And I think its elevation to its certainty, to its self-consciousness is that process of kind of what he's pointing out at the end, where it's like it meets its end or it meets its other.
Actuality is another word. I don't really know what he means, because he uses the word real and he uses the word actual, and I don't think those two words mean the same thing. And I'm not sure, but it's helpful. What you said is helpful to me, because that does seem to be right. I mean, I'm hoping Eric will correct us if we're wrong, but that it does seem to be, anyway, since I don't know if you saw my note, but Hunter and Travis are skipping the state, but it seems like those words maybe they have sort of a relative meaning at different moments in the dialectic, I guess. And one of the difficulties is in the tradition, much of the tradition stemming from at least Plato and Aristotle, is some of those words like essence and being have very fixed meanings. The meanings don't change. And yet, like you said, maybe part of the takeaway here is that they have meanings for Hegel relative to the dialectical process he happens to be talking about at the time. And that's just really hard for, someone grounded in this tradition to hang on to.
So I guess my experience is a little different but related, Nevitt. And you were talking about earlier when you read and you seem to think, because we have these, you're trained in philosophy, so you know what essence means, right? And then you read Hegel and you seem to think he knows what he means, and then you figure out that like, oh, what he meant by essence can't possibly mean what I thought it was. Otherwise, it would, this construction wouldn't make much sense, or it would jar. So then you just kind of like I like the way you put it, the rug was pulled out under you. My experience has been that, I guess going into it, I already had a notion that essence was a particularly idiosyncratic concept for Hegel, what he does with essence. So nearly every time I read essence, I'm just suspending it. You know what I mean? I'm just using this particular context as a clue for what I think he might mean by essence, but I'm not making any judgments yet because there are many more contexts to come, right? But if you keep doing that with key terms in Hegel, which I've done particularly with essence, but also somewhat with spirit, somewhat with being, somewhat, with a lot of these things, you just kind of suspend really, any confidence. You're just kind of like, okay, that's my first context. Let's see what we get from my second and on, and the idea will develop as we go. And here we are halfway through the book, and there are whole sections I read where like I've already suspended too many of these concepts. I still can't, it's all kind of vacuous. The rug was never pulled out from under me because I didn't get my feet on the floor. You know what I mean? But that said, I mean, I'm still getting something out of it, right? I'm still finding important things in Hegel, right? I just mentioned in passing, I think what you were hitting on earlier, Nevitt, in terms of like, the opposition to Plato, but the ultimate affirmation of Plato, yes, this phenomenal world is all becoming, but guess what? It's not chaos, it's a structured becoming. When you were chiming those notes, I was thinking that well, not precisely that, but almost precise. That is to me what attracts Hegel, or Hegel is, to a lot of the following thinkers. I think Marx, looking at, a dynamic changes in society, and then thinking about how this becoming can actually be structured in a way that you can explain it and perhaps interact upon it. I think that, the structured of becoming, I think, is one of the main themes of Hegel that recommends him. That's why people want to reappropriate, reinterpret Hegel. They want to see structured becoming, just a materialist structural becoming, right? And probably you got some things wrong, so we need to jostle with some of the concepts. And I wanted to mention one thing about truth. I personally, and this is just where I am right now in my philosophical journey, but I've long felt that correct me if I'm wrong about the Nevitt, but I want to say the correspondence theory of truth is very much like a dogma in analytic philosophy, or a main, I'm sure.
I'm not really sure. I don't really don't really know analytic epistemology very well.
Right. Yeah, and I took epistemology with Hutchison, and we didn't investigate truth, and but I know the correspondence theory is huge. It's probably had, minor arguments with minor alterations, but it still seems to have cast a long shadow over what our contemporary notion of truth is, which is similar to what Descartes was, right? The notion in the mind corresponds to the notion in the world. And so truth is that kind of identity or correspondence, which is a big part of Hegel, the identity between being and thought, right? So I do think that notion of truth as correspondence is there in Hegel, but I don't think Hegel is limited to that notion of truth, kind of what Joey was hinting towards earlier. There's a sublated version of truth, which seems to include that, but more. And in the more, I would include artistic truth. When a poem, the way I used to explain to my students is it's like a poetic truth. Like if you're going to write a story, and certain stories that developed a certain way, the character is not entitled to the happy ending. No, they have to suffer, they have to die, right? And that is the truth of the story that you're telling. And if you were to change the ending or slap on it, the movie Brazil, directed by Terry Gilliam, is one of my favorites. Okay, and there were two endings to it, right? They released an American ending where he drives off into the sunset, and he gets the girl, and then the rest of the world ending, where that last bit of driving off into the sunset is just part of his dreamscape, because he is exactly where you thought he was, basically being tortured and killed, right? So they gave it two endings, and if you watch the movie from beginning all the way up until the two possible endings, there's only one true ending. The other one is false. It's fake, right? It's a sappy one to satisfy an audience that's not prepared for the hard truths of life. And again, that indicates another one, the hard truths of life. This is not a matter of correspondence, right? I mean, I guess in some ways you can conceptualize it as a matter of correspondence, but I don't think when we use the phrase hard truths of life, we're limited to a notion of truth as a correspondence between an idea and a fact of the world. You know what I mean? That it's more along this other notion of truth, which I also want to throw into the mix, is that of the arrow. I want to say that the true flight of the arrow is one which is more amenable to ethical talk, to talk about ethical truth, right? Is one that is in keeping with purpose, or an aim that's already been decided beforehand, or an aim that is consistent with other aims, right? But the true flight of the arrow, I think, is an important idea around the concept of truth that is very much in there in a lot of philosophical discussions of truth. And then Heidegger had aletheia. I want to say, and I might be wrong about this, but this narrowing of the notion of truth to a mere correspondence between an idea and a fact in the world, and limiting it to propositions, right? I want to say that is one of the big missteps of the Anglo-American analytic trend in philosophy, is to constrict our notion of truth such that it closes off possibilities for finding ethical truth, poetic truth, aesthetic truth, and again, by consequence having more meaningful, purposeful, filled and lives and things like that. Again, my waxing and speculation there.
Well, were you, I thought what you were saying, Eric, was tying it back to your interpretation of Hegel, is when Hegel's talking about truth, and he might be using the term in ways when we're reading him in different ways. So we're like, oh, I thought I knew what he meant by truth, but now he's saying this. Well, if you could change his conversation, his analysis of truth into small t, not capital T. So is Hegel, if you understood Hegel to say there's multiple truths, right? I mean, what if you hear a story, what if you read a story that starts with the words once upon a time? Aren't you instantly going to understand it in a way differently than you would with a different beginning, right? We've kind of been trained, right, that every single fairy tale starts at once upon a time. And you talked about the true path, the true arc of the arrow. Well, what is the true path of the arrow would be different if you're in a battle using a bow and arrow. The true path of the arrow is you want to get it into someone's chest or in their head. You're not talking about a geometric arc that because of gravity, it's going to land in the ground somewhere. So, I mean, I hadn't thought of it that way, but maybe the reason why we're having problems is that Hegel's talking about multiple situations for these concepts, and that the historical truth is not going to be poetic truth, and it's not going to be religious truth, but they're all in some ways have some validity. And to use an example, I don't know if you've noticed this, but movies, if everybody in a movie accepts something as true, we, the audience, will accept it, even if the time doesn't work. Can I give you one example that I hope, did you ever see the original Kung Fu Panda?
Yes, and I refuse to acknowledge the existence of the second one. There's only the first and the third.
Okay, well, but you're saying that you refuse to acknowledge those other two doesn't mean that they don't.
No, just the second one. Just
Yeah.
the
Okay.
1 and 3.
Oh, 1 and 3. Okay, well, I don't know what Hegel would say about that, but if you, but I hope you do, because it's interesting. Anyway, the whatever the Marmot, whatever the character voiced by Dustin Hoffman says to the duck, warn the prison, double the guards, double everything. The duck flies off instantly. When the duck gets to the prison, the rhinoceros running the prison unrolls a scroll, right? And he says, double the guards, double the this. Are you saying that you don't trust the prison? He goes, no, I'm not saying it. Sifu is. Nobody catches in those two scenes that Sifu never wrote out orders on a scroll. Now it works better, right? I mean, who wants to watch this animal write on a scroll? I mean, it destroys the movement of the movie. No one catches it. And that's okay, because you would expect there to be written orders, right? The sense of time in a movie. If you ever see any Hitchcock films like North by Northwest, there's no way that conversation at the airport could be that short for him to convey all that information to the government official, to the character. Look at Casablanca. I mean, all I'm saying is that I'm sorry to getting so popular culture, but I think we all live in a world where there's multiple environments and multiple truths. And it's funny when you see a little kid react to a joke, right? They'll be real rational. Yeah, but you said the man didn't talk. You know what I mean? And then but the punchline is the man talking. You know what I'm trying to say? So almost little kids with certain kinds of humor, they'll be very literal and say, wait, your premises are not valid. You said these things, and then at the very end, he spoke. And so anyway, to me, when you said that, Eric, I thought, wow, maybe that's why we're having trouble. He is really, because you're dealing with human beings.
One thing that troubles me about the talking different kinds of truth is, and this I'm kind of getting us off track, but is, this thing you'll hear, well, what is your truth? Well, what is your truth is not my truth. And you get in this thing of the subjectivity of truth, the radical subjectivity of truth, such that, well, my truth is that the COVID vaccine is effective, and your truth is that it's not effective. And, so you get into, I get uncomfortable with that kind of language. But on the other hand, so I don't know, I'm guessing maybe Hegel would say, kind of like Joey was saying, is that truth is not complete. Because, the thing is, if truth means anything, it means nothing. And there has to be some constraint on what it can mean. Although, I guess it sounds like what you're saying, Ed, is that what it means is sort of context dependent, which doesn't mean it's without any meaning. It means it has different meanings in different kinds of contexts. And that seems to be, consistent with, our sort of consensus about this, that these terms, in a sense, are relative to their dialectical context. There's certain, and that's probably something worth keeping in mind. This is, going back to something Eric said about Hegel wanting to reconcile thought and being, rather than thinking of that as correspondence. And I don't know if this is true. What I'm hoping Hegel is doing is something similar to contemporary phenomenology. And I realize it's a big mistake to conflate those two. Contemporary phenomenology, or 20th century phenomenology and Hegelian phenomenology I'm sure are related, but they're certainly not identical. But the idea, I think what at least the 20th century phenomenologists were trying to do was undercut this radical distinction between mind and world. And so, for example, in Descartes, you do have a radical distinction. You've got the mind, which is non-physical, and then you have the physical world. And, on some interpretations of Descartes, the non-material soul is connected to the brain through the pineal gland. And so the body collects sensory data and then somehow feeds it into the pineal gland and through this tether, to the soul. But the notion of adequatio or of adequation is that, when Descartes says my idea is true, he literally means this image that is only in my mind corresponds to this real thing out of the world. And the mind and the world are completely distinct. Whereas, at least in 20th century phenomenology, they're trying to undercut that radical fracture between mind and world. And I hesitate to say dialectical, but this 20th century notion of intentionality is that the world and the mind are sort of co-constitutive. They sort of cooperate in a sense to create a reality. So it's not idealism in that everything's created by the mind. It's not materialism in that everything's material, but there's some sort of interactive process there. And I don't know, but I'm hoping that when Hegel says, the thought, trying to reconcile thought and being, I hope he's not trying to come up with a notion of correspondence that says, well, the idea in the mind exactly corresponds to the thing. I'm hoping he's doing something at least similar to what 20th century phenomenology is doing, and saying that thought and being are not radically distinct. But I just don't know. Like I said, I don't know if that is what he means. I don't really understand what he means, because I don't understand what nature is. This something that seems to be without mind, and yet there is mind, and so I don't really know what the relationship is. But that it seems like in spirit he's trying to get a little closer, at least, to maybe fleshing out kind of what that relationship is.
Eric, I think you mentioned the movie Brazil. The movie I'm thinking of is a little less depressing, but for lack of a better word. But did you ever see? It's the movie with Matt Damon. It's a few years old because it's Matt Damon and Heath Ledger play the Brothers Grimm. But they actually are hired by the French government to investigate something going on in a German forest. And it's kind of the sensibility of that movie is like Brazil, but putting it in instead of a futuristic anti-utopian context, the context of Germany as a region, not a country, during the Napoleonic Wars. But you get the sense of arbitrariness that arises, and but there is a happy ending. So that's why I'm saying it's kind of like Brazil light. You do get an awful lot of darkness and arbitrariness, which, how can that be when those armies are purporting to represent what? Rationality, enlightenment, right? Science, turning back on superstition, and a new world. So, but remember, he wrote this, wasn't he composing this when Napoleon strolled through the town he was in, 1807? So, I mean, Goethe saw a battle and where the French army defeated the crack troops, I think, of the Austrian Empire, and he said, "Oh well, okay, we're living in a new world now." So, you know, I'm sure that he's trying to get a handle on what happened on January 6th and how so many leaders of the Republican Party are saying, "Oh, it was a tourist visit." I mean, I'm a philosopher. How do I explain? You know what I mean? How do I somehow have some kind of philosophy that would make not only the events of January 6th, but then the last 6 or so months of a major political party of the United States make any sense whatsoever?
You know what? Tell me if you think I'm wrong about this, but what it seems like one of the shifts going from reason to spirit. This isn't exclusively true, but it seems like no, that's not. Anyway, what it seems like in the previous sections, he was more talking about, I don't know what, consciousness in general, and then when he starts talking about self-consciousness, it seems like it was more the self-consciousness of individual subjects, or at least as the confusing thing is sometimes he says, I'm talking about the individual, but I'm not talking about the specific individual. It's like I'm talking about individual as a type, or
the universal individual.
Exactly, the universal individual, which sounds like a contradiction in terms of it. But then sometimes he's talking about the specific individuals. But toward the end of the section on reason, he starts talking about law-giving reason and laws and stuff like that, and the social estates. And then when he gets to spirit, it seems like he shifts completely into talking about the corporate domain. In other words, the ethical domain, specifically being how do human beings interact with one another. And so it seems to me that's one of the big shifts. And I'm curious as to why he would specifically call that spirit. I mean, he mentions spirit all throughout those earlier sections, not very often. The word spirit shows up here and there. And so, as of course, everything Hegelian, they're all going to be closely related. But when he has a section specifically about spirit, he's talking about, he's explicitly talking about ethics and the family and the state and the relationship between those two. And so, and then like Eric was saying, these big manifestations of spirit are art, religion, and philosophy, which are again social dynamics. And so it's interesting that it's just interesting that when he starts talking about these explicitly social domains, that's where he decides to call the section spirit. And I feel like I should understand why that's the case, but I don't really understand it. And just to make a comment on Joey's thing, I saw Antigone all over the place in this section. When he's talking about the family and its tension with the state, and and the family is the manifestation of the divine law, and the state is the manifestation of the human law, and that there are these tensions between the two. I mean, I thought that was just like Antigone all over the place. So, but the thing is, one of the things I have become very cautious about too is assuming that Hegel is going to endorse something because of this dialectical thing. You think, oh, he's endorsing the family over the state, but then, you read a little bit further, it's like, oh, no, he's not. And so I don't really know, like, what he, like in the Antigone discussion, we were, like which one is, right, or, is the author saying, Antigone's, we should be sorting Antigone, or should we be supporting Creon? And but I really don't know how Hegel would answer that question. I mean, maybe I will as he gets further, but at this point, I thought, Antigone, but I don't know.
The play is a tragedy, right? Isn't it showing that like both of them are right? And I feel like maybe Hegel wants to say that too, that like both of them are right. And I'm wondering if how he's saying something about action, how action is kind of what brings it to its downfall. I feel like maybe the story in Antigone is like that very, like, exhibition of that happening. Like when the individual like does live up, when the feminine lives up to that role, and when the male, the public figure, like lives up to its role and like chooses that side, right? When that side is chosen, then like what happens? Like kind of like, I'm guessing that's how we get from like the Greek perfect ethical substance to like the Roman, the response. I'm not sure yet, but
Joey, Antigone obviously is a woman, as is her sister Ismene, but my understanding of the background to the play is that her and her sister are the only living relatives of her brother, who has not been buried by the orders of Creon. And so it's not that she's a female, she's the closest blood relative to her dead brother. So she has a familial obligation, but she also has a religious obligation as a person of her faith to bury that body. See what I'm trying to say? So that it's more of like a trilemma. It's not a dilemma. It's she has a responsibility as the closest family member to him. She also has a religious obligation that she wants to make sure that that body is buried. And yes, as her sister points out, but we're just two women. We're weak. Creon has the power of the state behind him, of the government. And if we bury the body, you don't think nobody's going to notice. So all that's going to lead to is we're going to be dead and he's going to be dug up, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of burying him in the first place. But so for Antigone, she places her familial responsibility and religious responsibility above that of her civic responsibility to the edict of the king.
Now, I don't know. I have no idea what Sophocles would say, but I'm thinking, like Joey was saying, I would have to put my finger on the specific passage, but I got the impression from this part of Hegel that he was saying that now, people would complain about this today, but that the woman is kind of the guardian of the divine law, might I say, that the family is under the divine law, and that the male is the the person who steps outside of that. He says something almost more or less explicitly, steps outside that family in order to participate in the polity. And so that now, again, I don't know what Sophocles would say, but it seems like Hegel is making that kind of, I'm assuming, if we're assuming he's at least thinking about Antigone as an illustration, then it's because it seems like he's saying that Hegel is saying women are really, they're kind of the law of the family, and the men are kind of the law of the state. And then here you have that conflict. And I guess an interesting point there is then her brother, as a member of the family, his sister has these obligations, but then as a member of the state, Creon has certain obligations. So like Joey was saying, maybe that's why it's a tragedy, is because you have these opposing obligations converging on a single person. And then then these, which I'm not sure what to do with these comments that Hegel makes about the dead, and that when a person's something like when the person is dead, then they become the universal. Let's see, the sense of the action is instead that because the motionlessness and universal of self-aware essence does not in truth belong to nature. Anyway, this is section 451 on page 260, when he starts talking about like 451, the universality to which the singular individual as such, as a singular individual has arrived, is pure being, death. And so I don't know how to take his comments on death, but it seems like the dead brother is kind of a I don't know if manifestation, but kind of an illustration of this, whatever point he's trying to make there. But I don't really know what he means by this, the universality. And there, I guess, like we were talking about earlier, where he talks about individuality as a type and then the singular individual. Here he explicitly says, and I assume he means like that person there has the universality to which the singular individual as such has arrived at pure being, but that's that dead body laying there on the street, I'm guessing. And then since no one's talking, I'll just kind of ramble on. And then it seems like what part of the purpose of the family then is because, Hegel seems to be so concerned that, I don't know if concerned is the right thing, but the function of, I guess, consciousness is to return to itself. Maybe broadly speaking, that's the function then of spirit. But when you have a dead body, that dead body can no longer do that because it no longer is conscious. And then so from what I understand this passage is he's saying, then the family has to take that role, and that the dead body is kind of, redeemed is probably not the right word, but the reflective capability of the living family is what brings the death of that thing that has now become a thing of nature that does not have consciousness. It is through these rituals that, I guess, like Antigone is performing, it is through these rituals that dead body is, again, reflectively returned into the family. And that's one reason why it's so crucial, I think, for Hegel.
Yeah, I agree with that point. I want to say, like, underlying all of this, thousands of, goodness, probably hundreds of thousands of years of ceremonial burial, right? Is this notion that this body is still more than just a thing, right? This isn't just dead matter, like a fallen tree is dead matter or a rock is dead matter, even though this is still, a human being who's technically dead. For us as human beings, this cannot simply just be a thing, right? And that seems to be something, I wouldn't say innate, but almost ingrained, in human being, that stretches back, hundreds of thousands of years, right? want to say that's something to, behind Hegel's, description there of bringing, and it's the family's responsibility, right? To bring that person back into the family, by insisting that they're more than just a thing, right? Even though they lay beneath the earth or in ashes or whatever it is, your rituals call for, that in that act, you're bringing the person back into the family and ensuring that they remain always something more than a simple dead material.
Does Hegel, in talking about Antigone, does Hegel deal with his understanding of the religious beliefs of the ancient Greeks? Because you were stressing family, which I'm not discounting.
Well, hey, I mean, I don't know anything more about what Hegel says. I don't know. So I don't recall him specifically mentioning Antigone in this passage. And so it's possible that, we could be outlined, but some of these passages are so similar to the situation in Antigone. It seems plausible that he's thinking of Antigone as a case. And this whole section is full of stuff about the family and the tension between the family and the state. And so that's where I'm getting that from, is Hegel is the divine law is the family is an aspect of divine law, and then you've got human law that is connected to the polity, and then you get these tensions between the family and the polity, and it seems like all of that's at play in Antigone. And then again, he then talks about the role of women versus the role of men, and the women, this is Hegel, women are sort of the law of the family and men are the law of the state, and so that's, I don't recall him specifically, although I think he does somewhere. I looked in the index and didn't find Antigone, but this sure seems to be at least well illustrated by Antigone.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, because maybe it's because of Hegel's dialectical reasoning that he's opposing state, family, male, female, but the secondary literature I've read about Antigone suggests that there is this third component, which is, if to the ancient Greeks, if the body was not buried properly, then you were literally interfering with that soul's ability to function in the afterlife. There was actually a negation of their ability to have a better afterlife. So my sense is that, and I apologize for saying this, but I think Hegel is missing something in the dynamic of what's happening in Antigone, because he's missing, or he isn't, begging your pardon, he's not discussing as fully the religious belief aspect of it as he is the familial and the civic. Because my understanding is that's absolutely critical in Antigone's assertion, her pushing that she is going to bury her brother. Because remember, she talks about no king has the authority to I'm putting words in her mouth, to profane sacred law. There is, she's usually kind of like a natural rights tradition, right? No king can deny these truths, these beliefs we have about our religion and the proper role of burial in that. He doesn't have that authority, right? These beliefs existed before he was born, and they will exist after he's dead. And so what he says about it cannot negate these religious truths that we live by. And in fact, remember when, did you get to the part earlier this week, Nevin, talking about Crayon's son Haman arguing with his father? Oh, okay. Well, basically these conversations repeat themselves. They're not perfect parallels, because in Antigone's argument with her sister, Antigone is constantly referring to their religious beliefs and family obligations. The son Haman, when he talks to his father, doesn't necessarily, he's indirectly talking about the religious beliefs of the people, but he's basically almost giving his father a tutorial about, yeah, but father, yeah, you're king, but you're ruling over a group of people that have these beliefs, right? I mean, it's not exactly public opinion, but it's public sentiment. And so if you really look, and then at the very end, you've got the seer, the soothsayer, having a conversation with the king. So it's really interesting to look at the content of the arguments of the dialectic arguments, right? The dialogues. You got 3 dialogues, and then look at what they're hitting on in terms of having the alternate positions of this very important issue.
So I almost want to say that maybe like Hegel does take that into account. Like I'm thinking of, particularly I'm looking on section 452. And the fact that he kind of like pairs this like duty to family as also like the divine law. And I think like, and Calcavigil points out that it's not like maybe explicitly religion yet, this kind of like public religion that we think of it as, but it may be more of like a private family thing. Or I guess like to me, it does feel like this zeitgeist type, like it's the peoples versus the polis.
Say 452?
Section 452 on page 261. But I'm just thinking like, because he says some weird things here, like otherworldly realm beyond actuality. And he's talking about, I understood this, he was talking about the power of the person who's like just died and been buried. He says his power is that of the abstract, pure universal, the elemental individual, which constitutes the individuality, which tears itself loose from the elements, and the self-conscious actuality of the people, withdraws back into the pure abstraction as into its essence as their ground. How this power will exhibit itself in the people themselves is something which is still to be further developed. And that made me think like, is maybe he gonna talk more about that in religion? But I definitely was feeling like it, yeah, when I was like talking earlier saying like male female, I definitely didn't think it was just a male female thing, but he was making a lot of associations with like what femininity is kind of like pairing to, which is like this family, but through the family is this divine law, which I did get like a sense of like religion from that.
Well,
and then again too, when I was thinking like, you know, they're not directly against each other, right? And it seems like they're paired against each other, but I think what he's trying to show is that they do kind of like give way into each other. And I feel like the act of burial, something about that is supposed to represent, I think, the family's like connection, or it's like transitioning into that of like the ethical act. I was kind of confused on how, like at what point, and maybe that's a question I have, like at what point is he saying that like these two are transitioning into each other? Because I feel like he was saying independently, the polis has like a point at which it kind of like gives over to human law, and then the human law or the divine law, and then the divine law of the family also has this point at which it like enters into ethics.
If you look at the first sentence of 452, he's making a distinction that a lot of people will use when they're talking about law. This last duty thus constitutes the consummate divine law, or remember he says or it constitutes the positive ethical action. In discussions of law, when you see the word positive law, that's referring to statutory law from some legislature, right? Any team, and it's discussed in international law and in other places. So positive ethical action, the way he's using, the way the term positive is translated here, positive ethical action, because remember, that follows the word or. So positive ethical action, the ethical comes from the positive legal framework, right? The ethics is coming from a body of law passed by legislatures. See what I mean? So this last duty vis-a-vis the singular individual, right? This duty that constitutes either from divine law or positive law.
Now, you know, if you look a little further down in that same section, now, however much human law has for its content and power, the actual ethical substance conscious of itself, the whole people, and divine right and law have their content and power in the singular individual, who is in the otherworldly realm beyond actuality. Still, the singular individual is not powerless. His power is that of the abstract pure individual. But it seems like he's suggesting that, especially in death, that this person passes out of the domain of the human law and passes into this otherworldly realm beyond actuality, so that at least in death, this person now becomes the property of divine, or becomes a property of divine law and passes out of the positive law. That's what it sounds like.
I want to say that exactly is Tiresias's point, the blind prophet, when he, chastises Creon for confusing the laws of heaven and earth, or life and death. And I think it's that. It's like, you're right to want to exact punishment on a traitor. This guy's dead. You know what I mean? Like, you're not really punishing him anymore. You're trying to punish him in the afterlife, which is well beyond your remit. Some of the comments that were just made, it's, started, I want to say that, Hegel kind of wants to pit these as co-equal. This was a conversation that came up on Monday, right? Like, I came into Antigone kind of roughly this idea that what Hegel uses Antigone for is to kind of indicate an internal contradiction within Greek ethical life, right? Kind of pushing back a little bit on Joey in terms of like the perfect Greek ethical life. I don't know that Hegel countenances the perfect Greek ethical life. I think he sees that the Greek ethical life was also, wrought with its own contradictions, and Antigone is the best example of that. Only from what I was getting, like coming into it, I was thinking, okay, well, Hegel's going to pit them as somewhat equal. Creon's interest is just as valid and just as worthy as Antigone's interest, and that's just ethics. It just sometimes throws you into these contradictions where you're both right. I'm not sure that reads well when I read Antigone, right? When I read Antigone, it seems to me like Creon's wrong and Antigone's right, and the fact that it's a tragedy doesn't really suggest that they're both right. I mean, in Hamlet may not be purely right or purely wrong in everything good in everything he does, but Claudius is almost irredeemable. You know what I mean? Like, Claudius does have this moment of self-reflection and honesty where he says, I killed my brother, and I should repent, but really to repent, I'd have to give back the crown, and I'm not willing to do that. So let's be honest, I'm not willing to repent. And that moment of honesty is somewhat redeeming, but I don't think that's really enough to redeem Claudius as a character. Hamlet is a tragedy with it, where we can't really say, well, they're both right or they're both wrong. It's tragedy because of, other reasons other than mutually valid interests. There's more going on. I want to say the same with Antigone, that they probably less so with Antigone, right? I mean, their interests, their mutually antagonistic interests are more understandable. It's easier to understand Creon than Claudius, right, Joseph?
Well, yeah, because he's looking at his own self-interest, right? Of maintaining the king. And would you say it's worse? Would you say that Claudius is worse because he acknowledges to himself, yeah, I'm a real bastard. I killed my brother. And remember the circumstances of the murder. Remember,
Gertrude was
Shakespeare is
Claudius was a pawn.
But we're getting into religious territory. He killed his brother, and his brother died without what? The last rites.
Right.
He didn't have a priest over him as he was dying to protect his soul after death. And if you look at the way the king's ghost appears, how it's described, it actually follows Roman Catholic doctrine when it comes to spirits, ghosts, whatever we call it. It's really strange, because the first time he appears, the king's ghost doesn't say anything. And Eric, remember the classic line of Claudius is, "Oh, my offense is rank," and that's that acknowledgement. Yeah, I'm a bastard. All right, I killed my brother just so I could have the crown. And again, I mean, Creon could at least say, look, I'm deterrence, to use a modern phrase, I'm creating a deterrent. right? We've just had this bloody dynastic war. I won, but it wasn't easy. And if I'm too lenient, right, on I can't remember Antigone's brother's name. If I'm too lenient about how I deal with that corpse, am I incentivizing, to use modern phraseology, right? Is that enough of a deterrent? So I'm going to double down, and I'm just saying, no, you're not just messing with me, but I'm going to make sure that this traitor does not enter the Elysian fields. Polynices, yeah. So anyway, that was my reading of. I would agree with that Crayon is, well, not as bad as
Hey,
as
hey,
Hamlet's uncle.
hey.
Hey,
But Eric brought that up too. I think he made an excellent point in our Monday meeting. Is the most like what you were saying, Eric, about the most scandalous aspect of the play was when Hamlet wouldn't kill his uncle when he was having confession, because that would give his soul entry to heaven.
Right.
I didn't think of that before. That was an excellent point, kind of in tandem with what we're talking about.
Yeah.
yeah, but look at how brutal Hamlet was to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern. He changes the orders, opens it somehow, reseals it, changes the orders, and they're killed by a foreign king.
Which made for excellent play later on after
Yes,
Shakespeare. Because they're dead. So, dialectic process.
Yeah.
Speaking of, do you ever want to flip a coin over and over and over and over again and get the same result? You ever feel like you've stepped into that world, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Carry on.
So then maybe you guys have already covered this, or maybe you covered it Monday night. So then Creon is kind of trying to do the same thing by denying this. I think it sounds like this was Ed's point. He's trying to deny the brother sort of his afterlife rights by, so if that, so that you could make the same point that Eric made about Hamlet, in that then you could say Creon, whose domain is the political world, is trying to interfere then with the religious world, the world of the gods. He's sort of stepping, whereas that's something that Antigone actually has the rights to.
Yeah, she's adamant about her responsibilities, both as a family member and as a member of their religion, and has yeah, and so she's willing to pay any of the consequences from that, because it's and I don't know if you. It could also, if she does not do this, if she does not bury her brother, and this is such a compelling religious and familial command, one could argue it's somewhat selfish, but it is her, for lack of a better term, soul then threatened whenever she meets her makers, right?
So the point you raised about her being willing to make a big sacrifice, for brother, and that being a large part of her character, right? I think that speaks to the fact that, I don't want, well, forget it. Spoiler alert, okay? Creon changes his mind and he rushes to go tell Antigone, it's okay, you can bury your brother, but he's too late. And when he gets there, Antigone's hung herself. Now, the point I'm trying to make is, we could have had an ending where Creon changes his mind and gets there and tells Antigone, I've changed my mind, you can go bury your brother now. And Antigone's like, great, can I also still marry your son? And Creon, yeah, have that too, because, I was just a bastard there earlier, but I got better. Tiresias had a really good argument, and that's not the way it ended, because that wouldn't have been the true ending, right? One of the important parts of Antigone's character is that she was willing to sacrifice her life for her duty to her dead brother, and that doesn't really come out unless she does sacrifice her life. You know what I mean? just to reiterate a point I made earlier about the notion of truth, you know, and the way it had to end, you know, if had it been the false Hollywood ending, then that wouldn't have been a true story. You know what I mean? But as it is, it is a true story, even if none of it ever actually happened, which is a line I just lifted from Ken Casey, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Highly recommend you read it.
What was that line that you just said?
All of this is true, even if none of it ever happened.
Gotcha. Okay.
Which again makes sense to me if you can, you know, have a bigger notion of truth than the core.
Sure.
Theory,
Sure.
right.
This is a pretty big shift of topic, but I was curious what you guys thought. This is on page 262, like halfway down the page in section 454, when he says, the spirit of the universal gathering is the simplicity and the negative essence of these self-isolating systems. So he's talking about this, you know, this tendency of individuals to focus too much on individual rights rather than so there seems to be, again, this dialectic between individual rights and the coherence of the community as a whole. And he says, in order not to let them become rooted and rigidly fixed within this activity of isolating themselves, which would otherwise let the whole come undone and the spirit within it fade away, the government must from time to time shake them to their core by means of war. As a result, it infringes on their established order, violates their right to self-sufficiently, and throws them into disarray. By the labor the government imposes on them, these individuals who become more and more absorbed in their own lives and who thereby tend to tear themselves loose from the whole in striving after inviolable being for itself and personal security, are made to feel the power of their Lord and Master, death.
Page 262?
So
262,
yeah,
yeah, kind of right in the
so
middle.
I very much liked that section, and I mean, like, so I feel like Hegel didn't go into it as much as Kalkovich did, but the point about how, because to me, like, Kalkovich was kind of making the argument that, like, in burying the dead, you like save them from the naturalness of death, which I was kind of reading naturalness almost as like contingency, like death is something that just happens to us, but like burial is something that we kind of like we can take it back over, we make it like our own, we make like death an act, where it's just like, to me it's like, you know, it makes it rational almost, like it brings it back and you kind of like make sense of it. You maybe you think of an afterlife or whatever it is that the death is like the signifying. But and then like, so when he said this, made to feel the power of their Lord and Master, death, I mean, he didn't go into it, but Kalkovich was saying that like in the same way, like when you want to self-isolate into like your own personal singular individuality, but then in the time of war, like you're not allowed to face that anymore, and you have to like again like reconcile yourself with death. And he was kind of saying that like this is how like, and this part was kind of confusing to me, I don't think I quite understood it, but like this is the point at which like the like I want to say, is it the polis like becomes about the individual, and the polis is kind of like helping the individual reconcile themselves with death in the same way that the family helps the individual reconciles themselves with like an accidental death. Because like in war, it's like you're going to die and you're doing it and you like you have a purpose in your head, and to you it's like you overcome your fear of death, and this is like a thing. And I mean, Kalkovich is kind of arguing like this is what Hegel means. I didn't see that in here, but I just thought it was interesting.
I had not
Well,
put.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
What was the section too, really quick? Not just the page, because sometimes because my translations are mildly different, I get the wrong page over the
454.
section. 454.
I hadn't really put some of that together, but this is on page 266. You don't have to turn there. I'll just read it toward the bottom of the page. in section 461, he's talking about justice and the individual. He himself is the power of the netherworld, and it is his Erinyes, I don't know how to pronounce it, furies, which take vengeance and so on. And then he says, nature is the power that commits this wrong to consciousness. And, he does various places oppose nature to consciousness again. And so that, the stuff that Joey was saying about the sort of irrationality and that nature just shit happens and it doesn't make any damn sense. I mean, we still have that problem, right? When there's a hurricane and people say, what's the meaning of this? And what I want to say, well, there just isn't any. I mean, that's just the way it is. But it sounds like like Hegel's acknowledging that. And then like Joey was saying, then, maybe both war and these rituals are a way of reintroducing rationality and reason into these chaotic contingencies that nature imposes on us that we don't have any control over. That's interesting. That's pretty fascinating. And I had not thought of it in terms of war, but nations give you reasons to die. I think they're often stupid reasons, but they are nevertheless reasons. So maybe it's just
like,
another way to rationalize this craziness.
Right. A phrase that Kalkovage used it, what he said, burial is the act by which the family enters the natural process of death and spiritualizes it. That is, lifts it above nature. He says death is thus made active and conscious.
Yeah, that's consistent with what I was getting from this section. And like Eric was saying, it does seem to be pretty universal. I mean, even look today, like, when I grew up in the Vietnam era and fortunately aged out of it, I was fell into that little region where they canceled the draft and they started it again, or then they started registration, and I fell in the little space in between there. But I don't know, maybe you guys who are young, the Vietnam War wasn't such a big deal in your lives. There have been for ever since, people desperately wanting to find the remains of their brothers and fathers in Vietnam and bring them home. And you see this over and over and over, when there's these they find these mass graves and people want to identify the remains. And so it does seem to be very, very prevalent compulsion that people have to bring the remains home and to have some sort of ritual. This whole thing of closure, it's probably overused, but still that seems to be the general, it does seem to be. And and there's these weird things, like, I don't know if you've heard this, elephants apparently have death rituals where they will, when they find when one of their number dies, they will go and and do things to sort of apparently memorialize them in some way. So it does seem to be a very natural kind of thing to want to reintegrate the dead into the familial and social structure.
So I found the passage that Kalkovach kind of references, the part about war and the transition from human to divine, which I still feel, I'm reading it now, I still feel like it's not super clear to me, but I just wanted to read a little section of it.
So where is that again?
This is in Logic of Desire, the secondary source I'm reading, and this is him commenting on the war part.
Is this chapter 15?
I believe so. It's just the section that corresponds to this particular, chapter 15.
And what page is
It'd
that?
be on page 244.
244. This is what okay.
But he says, so in war, the polis reminds them of who they ultimately are as spiritual beings that rise above nature. So I'm guessing this is when we actually go to war thinking I'm going to die, you're just facing that. It forces them to confront death as their lord and master. Hegel's language here recalls the educational role of fear in the life and death struggle of self-consciousness. I am free to the extent that I rise above nature. And so it's like, yeah, and in the language here says it in Hegel in section 454 says, spirit, it sustains and elevates the self of its consciousness into freedom and into its force. But he says, yes, that's how I rise above nature. I'm free to the extent I rise above nature. In fearing death and by surmounting this fear in combat, I experience what it means to be a citizen. It is here that human law experiences its transition into the divine law. In sending me off to battle, the polis forces me to confront my mortality, the eventual loss of everything time-bound and finite, and the prospect of another eternal world, the realm that is under the earth.
Which is almost very Augustine City of God like, right? Like transitioning or having this ideal frame to sacrifice your life for. It's not so much the here and now, but the promise of the future, the promises of inheritance in that city of God, the ultimate divine law, which almost enforces a kind of almost an abdication, a sacrifice of everything that there is here that I don't know I really ascribe to. That's
Yeah, I mean, I'll admit that this section on the state especially kind of gives me the creeps a bit.
yeah.
So that's what I meant
Yes.
when I was reading it. I was just like, whoa.
Yeah. Okay.
Like the thing about war.
You know,
At
today,
least thank
I'm
you,
quite
Joey.
skeptical.
Right.
But
I
I
mean,
know when I get to this section, I'm going to be like, the fuck? You know? Like,
he talks about war as a legitimate tool, which right off the bat, but also, again, I haven't read it obviously, but I think it's much more prevalent in his philosophy of right, where he identifies government or the state with the ethical substance, as if, and I'm just thinking, really, like, have a look at our Congress. Find one ethical substance in our Congress. You know what I mean? Like, good luck, dude. You know what I mean? Like, and now I can go through some mental gymnastics and kind of squeeze it. You know what I mean? And say, okay, well, it's a polluted ethical substance, right? And so our government is going to be a polluted ethical body, right? But I just like I can't. If that's my image, you can't. That just where Hegel just lays it out and just leaves it. Like, no, that's, it's way too problematic. You know what I mean? People are not necessarily represented by their representatives. We can't just take it on face value that they are, you know what I mean? But he seems to go further than that, and just say simply that the government is identical with the ethical collective substance. And yeah, again, it seems to be a theme in the philosophy of right. And I'm sure most of us sitting around the table right now can say, well, clearly you got that wrong. But it leads me to the question again, like, where are these people getting off? When later thinkers were to, come out and say, well, we can't identify the government with the ethical substance, but we can do it in a roundabout, indirect, polluted way. You know what I mean? Like, the government is an anti-ethical substance, right? In a negative way. Well, actually, that's what Hegel meant all along. Like, oh goodness, no.
Yeah.
This is one of the things I want to point to when people are saying that, like, Adorno was just rehashing what Hegel really meant, but was confused for hundreds of years and nobody really got it. And then Adorno said this as a modification, reading against the grain. And then other people said, actually, Adorno was just, he thought he was challenging Hegel, but he was actually the only one ever got Hegel right. I don't know. I can't follow that. I mean, I'm stressing it. This point is one of many, identifying the government with the ethical substance. Adorno, repudiates that. And people are going to tell me that Adorno is just reading Hegel while he explicitly says he's reading Hegel against Hegel, against the grain, Anyway.
Well, I mean, obviously I'm living in 2021 and I brought up January 6th. I know government is beyond not perfect, but I mean, if somebody brought up city of God, well, then bring up the city of man, right? I mean, if you're Hegel and you're trying to deal with government, do you think in an era of monarchs that you can say, oh yeah, the polity is bullshit, the king's a putz, and when he's not a putz, he's really bad. You know, he's either an idiot, a moron, you know, or he's just a rapacious punk. I mean, if you're looking at kingship and that's being part of the polity, right? It's happening to, we say kingdoms, right? Monarchical government. If he's talking about the ethereal or the spiritual or the universal or the religious, the polity is supposed to be the ethical. I mean, for someone like Machiavelli, he didn't, from what my reading of Machiavelli, he didn't think there was a transcendental reality out there. The only reality for us in our lives, the only really true reality was the imposed legal order created by the use of force. But within that power-based order was actually law, right? Was actually rules that you were supposed to live by, that you could function, that most people could function in most of the time.
So I want to say that, you know, one of the things that Hegel contributes to discussions about morality and ethics is he puts, I mean, where Kant locates the ground of morality in reason itself, right? Hegel locates like the ground of morality in living in a community, right? It's just, you know, an aspect of communal living is this ethical obligations to your community. And I can follow that. And if we're going to talk about American ethical life, we can talk about how we collectively regard each other in various forms and iterations as, you know, ethical or quasi-ethical. What I have a hard time swallowing is that the government is somehow representative of the ethical life. For me, most of the representatives in government and much of the government itself is about power. You know, expressions of power, using power, manipulating people, exploiting people, extorting people. Just it's force, it's power, and it's not so simply ethical. You know what I mean? Sometimes it's very unethical or anti-ethical, right? I have a hard time identifying the government in this way. Although I mean, it's easier for me to do polity, community, even nation, you know, to a certain extent, right? But government, to me, that's where he seems to like cross a line, you know, and it just, to my taste, I suppose.
But what if your philosophy was based on that government is massively screwed up?
That's a great place to start.
Well, but yeah, but how are you going? What are you going to say to people about how they should live?
This is where I devolve, you know, at least from a lot of you guys' perspective, probably devolve into a Nietzschean thing. And the you know, I guess one of the things that sort of annoys me about efforts like this, I mean, I don't know, Eric, maybe I've got this wrong, but, you know, I think, you know, Hegel does want to say the rational is what, the actual or the real, I can't remember which. And that this dialectic is, you know, probably not governing is the right word, but is describing the movement of all of reality. And so that ultimately, you know, this is the right way for things to be because this is what the dialectic is doing. And I think that's just absurd. Right. I think, you know, this whole, you know, all of these efforts from these German idealists of trying to create a totalizing narrative that wraps all of reality up into a nice, rational, you know, system seems to me, I mean, I'm kind of with Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and those guys, like, that's just crazy. It's just not that way. And, you know, and the government, like you said, in its reality is really a power game. And let's just acknowledge the fact that that's what it is. And these guys don't give a fuck about, you know, any sort of right or wrong. What they care about is maintaining their power. And, you know, anyway, I just, you know, maybe that's too far, but it just seems to me claiming that the system, the cosmic system, is ultimately good in some way, and that the state is going to be a manifestation of that, I think is just ridiculous.
And to echo something you said earlier, I think this idea that the real is rational and that you may have moments in history where there are bad governments, but what they do is lead to a reaction where people think about better government. And so this bad government was necessary for the ultimate, development of a better government. And so it works out in the end. That makes me think of Leibniz and this, his idea that this world that we live in is already the best of all possible worlds. And I had thought that the Enlightenment was one of the things that disrupted, well, not the Enlightenment, the earthquake in Lisbon, among others, right? That idea is supposed to have been disrupted, right? But I guess it still lingered. I want to say it has a shadow there in Hegel's thought. Sorry, Ed, carry on. Ed.
No. Everything, I mean, I can't, obviously government is far from great, but again, okay, how do I phrase this? I'm going to be very partisan sounding just for a moment. If what you all said is true, it's a power grab, there are no rules, it's all a facade, it's been nothing but power and a power drive all the way since the beginning of time, and the United States is not separate from that power drive, then I can't condemn the Republicans for turning into a fascist political party and changing all these state laws so that a Republican legislature can pick the Electoral College electors. Even if a Democrat wins Arizona in 2022, it won't matter because the legislature will pick the electors, and then we'll have a Republican president because, according to the Supreme Court, no U.S. citizen has a constitutionally based right to vote for president. So if it's all a power game, then hey, if the Republicans win, then they won.
So, so here's my Nietzschean amoralist perspective on that. If my reading of Nietzsche is correct, then he would say something like, you are right in that you cannot say my political party is morally right and yours is wrong, because there is no ultimate morally right. But what you can say is, I have certain values. They are my values, and they are the values of these other people who agree with me. We disagree with those other guys' values. And for that reason, because we disagree with them, and I don't want to live in their world, I want to live in my world, we are going to try to change the world to better reflect our values because they are our values. And if you say, well, yeah, why don't you just overthrow them by military, like in a violent overthrow, because those are not part of our values. So if what it deprives you, what this sort of amoralism deprives you of, is the high horse of being able to say, I am ethically superior to you. And the reason that I want to have my government is because mine is ethically superior. It deprives anyone of having that king of the mountain position in the ethical world. But it does not deprive anyone from saying, these are my values, this is the world I want to live in, and I'm going to work to establish those values in society.
Many of the people who are, at least 40% of self-identified Republican voters are saying that representative government rules are not the most important thing to them anymore. It's public policy outcomes and it's election outcomes. And so there's a weird moment in the United States where people are saying how you just described a polity, Nevitt. There's my values, there's your values. I don't want to live in a country, but many people who are constituting the Republican base are saying, yes, it's about values, and mine are better. They do have a, you know what I'm trying to say? They do have they think there's a hierarchy of values and theirs are better.
Yeah, and I would just say, I don't care. I don't care whether you think your gut values came from God or from Zeus or whoever. I just don't care. I'm telling you, I don't like the world that you're building. I don't want to live in it. And I'm going to use every lever of power I have available to me to stop you and to make my world come to be.
And conversely, Ed, wouldn't you say that there's a lot of people on the other side of the culture war who insist that their values are better, that their moral stance is a superior moral stance to the people on the other side of the culture war? And I want to say it's useful and helpful, actually. I mean, you may personally, internally believe that your value set is in some way superior to others. But if you enter into the public sphere to argue for your value set in such a way that you never make the assumption that, or you never give off the assumption that your value set is higher, that to me, it actually empowers you more to get stuff done. I don't know, to make alliances, to build bridges, because the moment you start out with this, prior determined righteousness, already you've created alienation and division, and as in terms of real politics and forming alliances and making agreements and stuff like that, coming at it as if you have a superior moral set to the person on the opposite side of the table from you already puts you in a position where you like it's are you going to compromise with evil, or you know what I mean? Like it really makes it different. So I sometimes want to say, like, when I talk to certain Republican friends of mine, they seem to want to have a one-party state where it's just Republicans in control. But then I also talk to Democrat friends of mine, and they also seem to want to have a one-party state where Democrats are completely in control. And I want to say, shouldn't we come up with a framework where we negotiate differences in a civil way, and we respect differences?
But how can you do that if it's based on values? Okay, you're giving me 10 commandments. I'll take 5. You pick the 5. I mean, it's one thing to say we're going to create a boundary along a mountain range or on either side of a river. But how do you, if you're talking about how we're supposed to be living as a country, how do you compromise on values?
So let me ask you, Ed, if someone said to you, why should, and the should is important there because the should or an ought is an ethical claim that says everybody should follow these. I mean, to me, I think you are talking about values when you say, when you're talking about, certain democratic institutions and traditions, you're talking about values. And so if someone said to you or asked you, why should everyone in the nation, including Republicans, support your view of how things should run rather than somebody else's? How would you answer that? Where does that should come from?
Because it's not mine. It's something that has been occurring in the United States over time for over a century. And
so it's just a matter of sort of political inertia. It's just a matter of this is the way it's been for 200 years and so it ought to continue. It's an ought is fallacy.
To me, if a Nazi is elected president and he or she takes the oath of office, to me, they're lying when they take the oath. You cannot say you are going to follow the Constitution and defend and protect the Constitution of the United States and at the same time be a Nazi president.
But I'm sure you're aware, and maybe someone could go so far as to say Nazism is somehow compatible, but I'm sure, you're very aware that there are wildly different interpretations of the Constitution. And so just to say that there's a Constitution does not give you, I don't think, certain grounds for saying everything ought to be the way I want it to be, because there are plenty of, Supreme Court justices and constitutional scholars who would say, no, if you read the Constitution, you'll get something very different from the kind of world that Ed wants to see.
It's not.
So my claim is there are some extrinsic values that you're not explicitly addressing that defines, for example, how you interpret the Constitution. There are certain values you have that are about the way you want to see the world work and the way you want to see government work. And it's those unstated values that are guiding how you interpret the Constitution. And my or a philosopher's question is going to be, where do those values come from? How are they grounded? Certain right-wing people in this country are going to say, well, they're grounded in God. God is the one that tells me what those values are, and I interpret the Constitution accordingly. But where are you, what grounds your values that makes them universal and something that everyone in the nation should adhere to?
I'm not necessarily saying they're universal, because I'm not going to be talking about any country other than the United States of America. But again, my example of a Nazi being elected president, I don't see the content of Nazism being compatible with representative government. And if a Nazi president followed his or her ideology and there was a majority in both houses that were Nazi, I don't see how the United States could have truly competitive elections in the future. Because once you have a Nazi government, there's not a U-turn. There's not going to be a mechanism by which, because there will be laws that are changed and enforcement of laws that will change, even if on paper the Constitution is still there.
So, perhaps Nazism is completely outside the, maybe it's outside the possibility of a reasonable constitutional interpretation, but there are certainly lots of laws, I'm guessing, and political traditions that are technically within the Constitution that you would be violently opposed to. One, for example, I was listening to a radio story today that there's this, as I'm sure you're aware, the move of Republicans to say that it is state legislatures that have ultimately can decide who the electors are in election. And the people the people choose these electors, but that if the state government, if the state legislators conclude that the people's vote was corrupted in some way, then the state legislature should have that right. Well, it turns out, at least from the people I heard on the radio today, that is technically allowable by the Constitution. And so that's an example where I would never want to see that happen. But if it's technically allowable by the Constitution, then the Republican legislators who are trying to do this are not outside the Constitution. And so that's why, again, I say it's some sort of extrinsic value system that we're using to define what the Constitution allows and what it doesn't. Maybe Nazism is absolutely outside, but there are lots of other stuff that you and I would agree about, that other people would say, no, that's our view is in the Constitution, not your view.
All right.
And so then again, you say, so then what grounds those values and those interpretations?
Well, I'll send an attachment of a lecture I just gave, where I presented a whole series of, to me, very disturbing Supreme Court decisions that occurred in the last 21 years, where the Supreme Court has basically said state legislatures have no restraints on their authorities when it comes to election law, coupled with restrictions on Congress. Congress having a say in terms of elections and voting. And in fact, it was in Bush versus Gore that there was a statement made by one of the justices in an opinion that the citizens of the United States do not have a constitutional right to elect the president. So I totally agree with you. There obviously has been a majority of the Supreme Court in the last 21 years, 5-3 vote, 5-4 vote, 6-3 vote, giving all this carte blanche authority to the state legislatures. And I'll be the first to, obviously that's the reality, but that's my biggest concern, because it's coupled with a deterioration in the support for representative governmental norms.
Yeah, but like I said, there's those norms, and I think those norms are so, it seems to me that's an example of those norms are illustrations of people's values. That I have certain values, and so I think there should be certain norms, and other, like for example, Trump broke tons of norms, but a lot of them were not. There's no law that says he can't do that stuff. It's just that no president had the chutzpah and the arrogance and the disregard for tradition to break those norms. Well, he did, and a lot of his supporters are like, woohoo, go do that again. That's why I say again, it's, my values are strongly opposed to those actions. Other people's aren't. And it seems like the political domain is exactly that. It is a war of values. And
But that's what I'm trying to get across is for most of the history of the United States under the Constitution, there was a very strong consensus in favor of democratic, little d, democratic norms. And
Right.
that is disintegrating as you've been talking for the last 4 years.
yeah, but if it's a matter of consensus, then as the consensus change, so do the norms. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't pretend to be a philosopher, and I can't give you a complete system, even though I would hope I could. But
Yeah.
I feel very, very uneasy.
Oh, I do too. I'm very worried.
I mean, I feel in some ways that I'm living in Weimar, Germany in early 1931.
Yeah. I tell you, if Trump wins the next election, oh my God. We're in for.
And did you hear what Senator McConnell said in the last couple of months? And he was brazen about it. He said, if the Republicans gain control of the United States Senate in 2022, it doesn't matter if a Supreme Court justice dies in early 2023, he will not hold hearings. There will not be a vote on any nomination to the Supreme Court from President Biden. So if you're Democratic president, you only are allowed to nominate someone to the Supreme Court if your party is in control of the Senate. And that's never, ever, I mean, this is when all this talk about the filibuster, that's never been a norm in the United States Senate,
So
ever.
that reminds me, right? When was it Merrick Garland who Obama tried to nominate to the Supreme Court?
Yes.
And the Republicans their argument was like, no, we're way too close to an election. But the Democrats were like, no, it doesn't matter when the election is. He's the president, and he has the right and the obligation to nominate somebody to the Supreme Court. And then it was like a few years later, it was who's the new judge?
Ginsburg died.
Hmm?
Ginsburg died, and in October, in October 2020, McConnell shoved it through.
Right, but did we not see a complete reversal? Did we not
Yes.
hear Democrats saying, "Oh no, it's too close to an election. You can't possibly nominate somebody to the Supreme Court so close to an election." And then you had Republicans saying, "No, but he's the president. He has a right and a duty to nominate." And so, I mean, it just speaks to the quote again. I thought at the time, I think it fits now. The quote I gave of Nietzsche there: "All things are subject to interpretation." You have a
No, but if you look at the entire history of nominations, okay, there's never been a president nominating and the Senate confirming a Supreme Court nomination in October of a presidential election year before 2020. Never. Roger Taney died in October.
See you, Joseph.
Sorry. Roger
care.
Taney, the Chief Justice, died in October of 1864. Lincoln didn't move heaven and earth to nominate someone to replace him.
Yeah, but my point again is, these traditions and norms are traditions and norms. They're not grounded on any ultimate, metaphysical substrate, which is, exactly what people like Kant and Hegel are trying to see, Joey, are trying to do is they're trying to ground ethics in some ultimate metaphysical absolute. And, our country's traditions, well, the early fathers tried to, they tried to appeal to a divine grounding for these things, but the way that they built it, it's not, the problem with that, of course, is you're going to have different interpretations of what the divine wants. So, since it's based on precedent, like, since Supreme Court law is based on precedent, like one of my kids' political science, or not political science, but government teachers in high school told him that basically the norms in the United States are based on inertia. It's based on the idea that the system is so bogged down with red tape, and it's got to go through this process and that process and this process, that it creates a tremendous amount of inertia in the system, so that you can't have really rapid changes, because rapid changes are when you get sudden overthrows of government. And so since there is no absolute universal moral grounding for anything anywhere really, that the best you can do is build in a tremendous amount of inertia both in the legal systems and also in the traditions. And so you have these norms and traditions that take time to change. And that's really all we've got. But then you have someone like Trump comes in who's like, fuck the traditions, I'm going to change it right now. And there's just nothing in the system that's really capable of counteracting that, other than people willing to stick to the tradition. So in the, so again, in the absence of any absolute universal grounding, I don't.
He could have done a much better job after Franklin Roosevelt got reelected, to really look at the laws that existed. Okay, do you know that so much of the law, when they said about the January 6th, the confirmation of the Electoral College vote, by the vice president and everybody, that goes back to a law passed in 1877 to 1878. One sentence of that law is a page long. I mean, when there was a massive support for democratic norms is when people should have said, yes, but what is actually in law? And yes, I know the law can be bent, it can be ignored, it can be mangled, but I meant to bring this up earlier. Do you know how many Nazi lawyers in Germany in the 1930s were drooling at the thought of creating a Nazi constitution? They wanted to do it. They were itching to do it. Hitler said, no, we'll get to it later. I mean, to me, that is so perfect. To me, that's the essence of Nazism, is what limits. Once you have a written constitution, no matter how fragile that thing can be, right? It's still the organic fundamental law. And he didn't want anything constraining his behavior on anything, his actions as chancellor on anything. And so, yeah, I mean, what else? What's going to stop?
Yeah, I don't think there are any ultimate stops. That terrifies me. I like a lot of people, I just never thought that someone like Trump, I mean, apparently the founding fathers were aware of something like, this could happen, but the system doesn't really prevent it. And especially when an entire political party goes along. I mean, I don't, when Eric was describing the way the Republicans are behaving, I'm frankly skeptical when Democrats say, well, we are so much better, we are the morally superior. I don't know. There's so many examples of Democrats doing shitty stuff. I'm not, but in the last 5 or 6 years, the Republicans have been so obvious. They've been so obvious in just saying, we just want to maintain power. We don't really care how. And some people pretty much say exactly those words. And it's just astounding, that they're willing to be, at least, at least the Democrats feel like they ought to at least construct a plausible, some sort of plausible justification for what they do. The Republicans don't even do that anymore.
No, it's more of like the far right-wing political parties of Europe, like Le Pen in France, well, look at McConnell and Obama. I mean McConnell. I mean, even Republican senators then were so upset that McConnell refused to let things come to a vote, even though the Republicans could vote it down, because the Republican senator was saying, what voting record do I have? We voted on 5 things. I mean, and that was, and McConnell made a choice, and it was based on assumptions that proved to be correct, unfortunately, that hey, if something doesn't happen, they won't blame me, they'll blame Obama. And they'll blame the Democrats because they're in control of Congress the first 2 years. And so he slowed everything down. And there was a very good book. I don't know if you ever remember Norman Orstein. I think he's still alive. He's a moderate Republican who's written a lot. Well, he co-authored a book that basically said 80% of the problem during Obama's presidency was the Republicans. And the second problem was the press, for all of the attacks on it as being too liberal or too democratic, the press fell down on the job and said, like an exasperated parent, why can't you two kids get along in the back seat? Instead of saying, no, this is McConnell has just coagulated everything in the Senate. So, and again, I mean, trust me, I mean, there's so many things wrong with the Democratic Party, you don't know where to begin. But for God's sake, I mean, compared to what the transformation of the Republican Party from Reagan, which I had major problems with, but to Trump, look, you could say to Republicans in the 1980s, what are you for? And you get an answer: strong on defense, limited government, lower taxes. Now what it is, it's praying to the golden calf of a Trump bust. You know, it's whatever the fearless leader says.
Yeah, you know, when John McCain ran for president, I did not want John McCain to win, but if he had won, I still at least would have trusted that this man had integrity.
Yes.
And, you know, I may have not liked what he was doing, but at least I understood what he was doing. Whereas, you know, the Republican Party has pretty much forced, I don't know, most of those guys out. And so the only thing that's left again is people who they just want to maintain power. And right now maintaining power means sticking with Trump because Trump has the base. And that's pretty much the whole Republican calculus at this point. So, and I don't know, I mean, I don't see it going away. You know, from what I understand, you know, Trump has been deplatformed on all the big platforms, but the people that want to hear him can still hear him. And apparently, you know, from news reports, he's talking a lot. And so, and he's raising lots of money. So the future is scary.
Well, the thing is, though, not one major and there was an op-ed piece in a paper, either New York Times or Awesome Organization, where the person said, look, everybody's saying Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney are heroes, but they didn't vote for the first impeachment. They didn't say anything about Trump until after January 6th. And even after January 6th, I mean, how many Republicans who know better in the Congress have just, if all of them had said, this is not true, Biden won the election, if all of them said it, that's the problem. People are accustomed to trusting their elected representatives in the House and the Senate are buying into the lie. And then for God's sake, are they watching Fox News? If you want to be more scared to listen to someone, Nevitt, than listening to Trump, tune in on Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, I don't.
He's Goebbels. He's Goebbels. Okay, they are coming. They have come, and they've elected a president who doesn't represent our values. I mean, it was more Nazi than fascist. You know, the other, capital O, you know, them, who is undermining by their mere existence.
Yeah.
It's like the American Party, the know nothings of the 1850s, and then the libertarians of the last 20 years somehow took over the Republican Party.
Yeah, it's like, I guess they were waiting for someone to call them forth, and Trump did that. So, you know, there was this progressive, or actually more moderate fantasy that, you know, that things were changing, and it seems like Trump showed that no, things weren't really changing. It's just that as you said, sort of the social norms were such that it kind of kept all those people, you know, a lid on all that. And then when he came out, it's like all that stuff that was already sitting there boiling just blew out. And, you know, I'm probably closer to moderate than I am to, well, I'll put it this way. By contemporary standards, I am liberal. by traditional American standards, I'm probably more moderate, but, you know, the way everything shifted to the right, but I thought that, you know, I just didn't ever think that this could happen. and it's happened, and it seems to be getting worse. So I am quite worried. So, well, on that happy note, thanks for the interesting conversation. And
Nevitt, not now, but before Monday, or somebody, I meant to ask it earlier. I don't know what I'm doing wrong, but it's not letting me register for that. Yeah, so to talk about Antiquity on Monday.
so I sent you an email recently. What I suggest is that, and I tested this on my computer. On my computer, I was able to get onto Zoom and Discord simultaneously, to where I could see myself on a Zoom screen and also on Discord at the same time. And so what I was thinking is maybe you and I could set up a Zoom session like this.
Okay.
And then we could both launch Discord, and then we could try to troubleshoot your Discord connection. Because then we would have a Zoom connection where we could talk in real time.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that very much. It would Monday
would
make
fine.
more sense.
Yeah. Actually Saturday or Sunday or Monday, but I don't know if maybe Monday would be
Well, I
easy.
can email you on Sunday afternoon just to see if you're around, and if you're not, that's okay. I mean, we can do it Monday afternoon.
That sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah. And then hopefully we can work the bugs out.
That would be nice.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
You guys Monday. Bye.
Bye, Eric.